The morning mist clung to the ancient pines like a burial shroud, transforming the Pacific Northwest forest into a cathedral of shadows. Through my viewfinder, every branch became a gnarled finger, every shadow a potential hiding place. The air hung thick with decay and wet earth, a primordial scent that seemed to whisper secrets of the dead. I'd been tracking the white deer for 3 days, following whispered stories from locals who spoke of them like ghost stories, beautiful creatures that appeared only to those marked by fate. My name is Chen, and I chase beautiful things through my lens. Sometimes beauty leads to darkness. Sometimes it leads you home. The memory of my mother's empty bedroom still haunts me, her perfume lingering in the air, her wedding dress laid out on the bed, waiting for a final fitting that never came. Dad kept everything exactly as she left it, a shrine to his endless grief. Every year on her disappearance date, he'd sit in that room clutching her pillow, breathing in the fading scent of her presence. I grew up watching him die a little more each day, until he became a ghost himself, haunting our house in Seattle. The first piece of fabric caught my eye like a stark wound against the forest floor. White silk, delicate as moth wings, snagged on a thorny bush. Dew drops on the fabric sparkled like tears in the filtered sunlight. My fingers trembled as I photographed it, my old professor's words echoing in my head. The best wildlife photographers follow their instincts. But this was different. Something about that scrap of white made my skin crawl, made my chest tight with a primal fear I couldn't name. 20 feet ahead, another piece, then another. A trail of torn wedding dress fragments, each pristine despite the damp forest floor, as if they'd been placed there moments ago. I photographed each one methodically, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. The fragments seemed to form a pattern, like breadcrumbs in a twisted fairy tale. It wasn't until the 7th photo that I noticed them. Tiny red numbers, hand-painted on each scrap in precise artistic strokes. Not random numbers, dates, each one marking a moment when someone's world ended. The ranger station stood like a lonely sentinel at the forest's edge, its wooden walls weathered by decades of rain and wind. Inside, Ranger Mike Thompson's weathered face grew ashen as I showed him the photos. Deep lines around his mouth deepened, telling stories of countless sleepless nights. "Where exactly did you find these?" His voice carried an edge I couldn't place, a tremor of recognition and fear. When I showed him the GPS coordinates, he pulled out a thick file, dust coating its edges like a shroud. "You might want to sit down, Miss Chen." His hand shook slightly as he spread photos across his desk. Decades of missing person reports. All brides. All disappeared during wedding photo shoots in these woods. The photos showed women in white dresses, smiling with hope and joy, unaware they were posing for their last photographs. The first one vanished in 1982. Jennifer Adams, 23, kindergarten teacher. We found her 3 weeks later, posed like some sick mannequin, wearing a dress made of bark and thorns, her eyes ... He paused, swallowing hard. They were still open, still showing the terror of her final moments. There have been 12 more since then. My stomach lurched as he continued, laying out each case with careful precision. The dates matched the numbers on the scraps perfectly, forming a timeline of horror spanning decades. "The last one was Anna Chen," he said softly, placing a final photo on the desk. 20 years ago. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding into shadows. That's my mother. I barely heard his warnings as I stumbled out of the station, my mother's case file clutched to my chest like a shield. The photos inside showed a beautiful Asian woman in a white dress, smiling at the camera, her eyes bright with joy. The last photo ever taken of her. I'd been 6 when she vanished, too young to understand why Mommy never came home from her photo shoot. Dad never remarried. never moved her things, never stopped hoping. Now I knew why the white deer had called to me, why this forest had pulled at my dreams for 20 years. The forest felt different now as I followed the dress scraps deeper into the gathering darkness. Each step felt like a heartbeat. Each shadow concealed potential horrors. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching like grasping hands. The trail led to a cabin I'd somehow missed before, its weathered walls blending perfectly with the surrounding trees, as if the forest itself had grown around it. The windows were covered with thick curtains, but warm light seeped through the cracks, a sickly yellow glow that spoke of secrets and madness. Inside, the horror was worse than I could have imagined. Every wall was covered with photographs, brides in their final moments, terror frozen on their faces as they realized their fate. The photos were artistically arranged, a grotesque gallery of death. Some showed women running, their dresses torn, faces contorted in terror. Others captured the moment of capture, hands reaching from shadows to grab unsuspecting victims. And there, in the center of this macabre display, my mother. Her eyes wide with fear, tears streaking her makeup, her hands raised in a futile attempt to ward off her attacker. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice behind me was soft, cultured, with a slight European accent. My collection. I spun around, camera raised like a shield. He was tall, painfully thin, wearing an elegant but outdated suit that hung on his frame like a shroud. His fingers were stained with red paint, the same shade as the numbers. White hair fell in perfectly styled waves, framing a face that might once have been handsome, before madness carved its signature into his features. "You're a photographer yourself," he continued, gesturing at my camera with an artist's graceful hands. "You understand the need to capture beauty before it fades, to preserve it forever." "Where is she?" My voice cracked, tasting of copper and fear. His smile was gentle, almost kind, the smile of a teacher preparing to share a precious secret. "All my brides are here. They'll stay beautiful forever now." He led me to a hidden door, downstairs that creaked with each step like the moans of the dying. The basement air was cold as a tomb, heavy with the sweet, sick smell of preservation chemicals and decay. They stood in perfect rows, each bride preserved and posed in dresses of woven bark and thorns, faces frozen in eternal terror. Some reached toward invisible saviors, others cowered from phantom attacks. Each pose was carefully choreographed, a dance of death frozen in time. And there, in the center on a raised platform, was my mother. Her skin had been preserved somehow, taken on a waxy sheen, but I'd know her anywhere. Blood-stained thorns pierced her flesh through the twisted wedding dress he'd created for her, a crown of branches adorning her head like a bridal tiara. "Marcus Thorne," he said, bowing slightly as if we were at a gallery opening. "Former designer to New York's elite, until my own bride left me at the altar. Such a common story, isn't it? But I found my true calling now, creating permanent beauty." He lifted my mother's old wedding dress from a carefully preserved box, the silk still white as fresh snow. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah. A daughter in her mother's dress. It will be my masterpiece." The fight was brutal, desperate. He was stronger than his thin frame suggested, decades of moving bodies having built wiry muscle. His fingers clawed at my throat as he tried to force the dress over my head, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered about perfect poses and eternal beauty. I kicked, bit, scratched, but he kept coming, muttering about his collection, about preservation techniques, about the perfect way to position a corpse to capture true fear. My salvation came from my camera. As he lunged again, I triggered the flash directly in his eyes. He stumbled, screaming, momentarily blind. His hands clawed at his face, giving me the opening I needed. Grabbing one of his thorned dresses from a nearby mannequin, I forced it over him, driving the spikes deep. His screams echoed through the basement as he thrashed, each movement driving the thorns deeper into his flesh. Blood bloomed like roses on the white bark of the dress. I don't remember starting the fire, just watching as the flames consumed the cabin, the smoke carrying the ashes of 20 years of horror into the sky. The preserved brides burned like paper dolls, their twisted dresses feeding the inferno. As the roof collapsed, I swore I heard singing. A wedding march played on breaking bones and screaming wood. They found enough evidence in the ashes to close 13 missing persons cases. They called me a hero. But darkness leaves its marks, deeper than scars. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself reviewing the photos I took that day. The scraps of dress, the numbers, the brides in their final moments. My fingers trace wedding dress patterns in magazines, imagining how they'd look woven with thorns and bark. I dream of white deer in the forest, leading me deeper into the shadows. And sometimes in the mirror, I see my mother's face looking back, wearing a crown of thorns, smiling that terrible frozen smile. The ranger station got a call last week. Another bride has gone missing in the forest. They asked for my help with the investigation, knowing I'd been there before. As I pack my camera gear, I notice my hands are stained with red. Not paint, not blood, but something deeper. Something that won't wash away. The forest is calling, and somewhere in the shadows, beauty waits to be preserved forever. Through my viewfinder, every branch becomes a finger, every shadow a potential hiding place. And sometimes, if you look carefully enough between the trees, you might see a flash of white in the darkness. A deer, perhaps. Or a dress. Or something else entirely. Something that leads lost souls home to their final pose. After all, every collection needs new pieces to stay fresh. Every artist needs new material. And the forest always needs new brides. I check my camera bag one last time, making sure I've packed the red paint. The numbers must be perfect after all. They always have been.